Not quite 5 years ago, at the age of 59, I married the first true partner of my life. We'd both been divorced for 25 years. We'd each been single parents of 3 children for a very long time. And we met on a Match.com date. I like to say this to give hope to all those others out there. I met a lot of people who weren't Jim on Match.com dates, but it only takes one. That first date actually lasted 5 hours, and I kept wondering why Jim never got around to ordering food. He said, "I was so blown away, I forgot." Well, I knew right away that this was a man of great quality and substance. He was smart and funny and very handsome. He was a really good listener. He didn't say a whole lot, but when he did say something, it was invariably interesting. But still, I have to tell you that I did not foresee him as a long-term partner, and the story that I'll tell to explain this does not reflect well on me. As a person who'd been on her own a long time, I called myself a solo operator. By necessity, I was one. I had a lot of romantic pictures of what my partner looked like. I'd had a lot of time to formulate this picture in the absence of the real thing. And the pictures were kind of formed by a lot of movies and old rock and roll songs and probably Disney in there somewhere. And I think I have a theory that because I had been on my own so long and taking care of just about everything for a very long time, I pictured that I wanted somebody very strong, and for me, the marker of somebody very strong would be somebody big. Somebody tall and sort of, actually the word that I used was burly. Well, Jim was 5'8", and a very trim 5'8" man. So on our second date, we'd been having a really great time, but I said to him, "You know, I'm sorry to say, I really like you and I want to continue to see you, but I don't think this is going to work long term, because you're too short." I have to say, he was 2 inches taller than me, but he definitely was not my burly man. Well, Jim was a very smart man, and he was an attorney, in fact, but how do you argue being 5'8"? So he was just silent, and we had another date. And on the next date, we were sitting on the deck of my home outside of San Francisco on a weekend when the Blue Angels, you know, that acrobatic fighter pilot team, were practicing their routines right over my house. And I pointed up to the sky, and I said to Jim as he was smoking his cigar, I said, "Boy, those Blue Angels, I think they're so sexy." Jim inhaled slowly on his cigar. I guess you don't inhale a cigar, but he took it. He put it to his lips and took it out, and he said, "Did you know that to be a Blue Angel, you cannot be taller than 5'8"? To this day, I don't know if that's true, and I'm actually not looking it up because it had the desired effect. I fell for that man. I told you he was smart. I had no particular need to get married, but it was important to Jim. He was kind of a traditional, old-fashioned guy, and marriage had not worked out very well the first time, so I was pretty leery of it. I actually had a hard time with putting on a ring. I didn't like the word husband. Wife was sort of difficult for me to pronounce, but we had that wedding up on a New Hampshire hillside with all of our 6 combined children gathered round. We serenaded each other with a John Prine song. Fireworks went off over our heads. But I do not name that day, just 5 years ago, not quite, as the day that I became a married woman. That came later. Well, the year that followed, we had a whole lot of fun and a whole lot of romance. We went out to dinner. We ate oysters on the bay. We went to Paris 2 times. We drove in his silver convertible, and we danced alone in the kitchen to very romantic songs. We bought a house together, and although we were by this time 60 and 61 years old, we were optimistic and confident enough that we envisioned a long future together that would include sharing the grandchildren that where we had never been able to share children together. We planted olive trees that took 5 years to harvest your first crop, and we weren't worried about that. One summer, the year after we were married, I really wanted to introduce Jim to New England, where I come from. He was a California guy. And so we bought on Craigslist for $1,800, sight unseen, a 1982 Chrysler LeBaron convertible, cherry red. And Jim took the entire summer off, something he had not done in his whole adult life as an attorney. And we flew back east, picked up this very red car, and spent the summer exploring all the places, letting me show him all the places that I loved. Well, 3 months later, 15 months after our wedding, just as we were preparing our bicycles for another super romantic adventure, Jim began experiencing back pain. And we went to the doctor together. I have to say, because I was this independent solo operator who wasn't going to let loving anybody, even this very lovable man, get in the way of my work and my independent career and all the things that were so important for me to do, it was almost a hard thing for me to leave and go with him in the middle of the day to a doctor's appointment, and I was already feeling a little disgruntled that we were going to get some diagnosis like gallstones that would interrupt all our fun plans. But when we got to the hospital, they told us that they needed scans, and when the doctor came back in the room, I took one look at his face and knew it wasn't gallstones. The diagnosis was pancreatic cancer. And they told us not to Google it. But the doctor went on to say that there was basically only one way that my husband, would survive this cancer. And that was a surgery called the Whipple procedure that involved complete reorganization of the abdomen, removing or changing, reconfiguring just about every organ in the digestive system. And probably Jim wasn't going to qualify for it anyway. And even if you got that Whipple surgery, about 85% chance was that the cancer would still come back. Still, all I heard was, Whipple procedure, only chance, we were going for it. We were going for it. I do not think I returned to my desk that I had left that morning for many months. I know that when I did, there was a thick layer of mold in the cup. Because from that day on, my mission in life was no longer my glorious independent life, but saving my husband's. And I never really saw this as a sacrifice. I knew all about sacrifice for children, not for a partner, never for a partner. It was just that the thing that was good for him became what was good for me too. And though the tumor resided in his body, it afflicted us both. So for the next 9 months, both of us were totally focused on getting the right chemotherapy, getting the right doctors, getting the right treatment, clinical trials, experimental drugs, scanning the country and the globe for a surgeon who would be willing to perform this surgery on Jim. And I heard myself using a pronoun I'd never used before, we. We're getting chemotherapy. We're getting radiation. And then the great day, and it was a great day, we're getting surgery. Well, the surgery lasted 14 hours. We traveled 3,000 miles across the country to Boston to receive it. The tumor was removed, also Jim's gallbladder, part of his small intestine, his duodenum, his stomach. A vein was transplanted from his neck. And we were going to go on with our lives. But after that surgery, there was one complication after another. A C. diff infection, weight loss, neuropathy. My husband was not out of pain a day in his life. One day, to sort of make him connect again to the life, to so much that had been lost, I invited all the members of his rock and roll band to our house, but that day his fingers went so numb he couldn't play his bass, and I threw out all the food. And a few months after that, his tumor markers began to go up again, and we knew the cancer was back. Still, we kept living our life, still dancing in our kitchen, taking walks a lot slower than I used to. I didn't know much about doing anything slowly. I had been a quick person, a quick walker, a quick doer of everything all my life. But I slowed way down. A book I had written, finished actually before Jim's diagnosis was published, and I didn't go on a book tour. I did something I didn't know much about, which was staying home. Except when I went with Jim. When he was a boy, a place he had loved was the Eastern Sierra in Northern California, and he wanted to take me there. So we drove there with an IV pole in the back of the car and a cooler full of antibiotics to infuse him with. He kept playing his guitar. He voted in the California primary. That was really important to him. And we listened to every Beatles album they had ever recorded, from the first to the last. About 8 months before this period, by now it was June, a year after the surgery, and the cancer was most definitely taking over his body now. But 8 months before, I bought tickets to see a Bob Dylan, outdoor Bob Dylan concert. And by the time that concert rolled round, just a few days before his 64th birthday, it seemed impossible that Jim could even get out of bed. But Jim announced to the hospice nurses, "I'm taking Joyce to see Bob Dylan." And he did. And as I wheeled his wheelchair back to the parking garage at the end of the night, listening to the last strains of Bob Dylan singing "Blowin' in the Wind," he looked at me and he said what were among the last words he spoke. "Did you have a good time, baby?" We decided we would not bring him back to any more hospitals, though I had spent many months there with him. We accepted finally that there was nothing more that we could do, and I put down all my notes of clinical trials and drugs and lay with him in the bed. My children, years ago, my 3 children had been born at home, and I felt fortunate that my husband was able to do so as well. On the last day he spoke, a friend came to see him and asked him what would seem like an odd question: "How are you doing, Jim?" And he said, "I'm great. I have been known. And I have been known too." And it struck me that for all my romantic dreams of nights on the town and trips to Paris, that there was nothing more beautiful or loving or intimate than that. No deeper form of love. Well, Jim died not quite 2 years ago. I was at his side. It was 4 days after his 64th birthday. I'm now older than he ever got to be. I hadn't worked. I was a person who had been working since the age of 13. I had never really stopped writing until those 19 months. But the night Jim died, I went back down in the middle of the night to our kitchen, and I did something I hadn't done for a long time. I opened up my laptop, and I began to write a book. It was really the only thing I could do that night. Tell the story. There were many times over Jim's illness when I heard myself say, if only you could learn the lessons of cancer without cancer. And that was what I wanted to convey. And that's what I hope to convey to you here today. So, the lessons of cancer. If you can't take something out of this brutal experience, what a terrible waste that would be. And Jim is not here to share the lessons, so I'll do it myself. The first is gratitude. I am grateful. Sometimes people say to me, life was so unfair. And I actually, as hard as it was, I never say that. Life was life. This is life. These are the things that happen in our life. And I am grateful, specifically because of all the hard ones, for all the good ones. I think I was always a person who appreciated the natural world and the outdoors, but I make it a commitment now to, whenever possible, never miss a sunrise or a sunset, or a star-filled sky, or a full moon, or any other phase of a moon that Jim never gets to see anymore. And if I'm standing, as I often am, at the side of some body of water that may look a little chilly, I think about how Jim would have loved to be there, and I dive in. There's forgiveness in there too. Recognition of all the petty things that we allow ourselves to be irritated by and angry about and disappointed by and impatient with, and I think how little they matter. Any day that I'm alive, I consider a lucky day. Well, the next lesson was a really hard one for me in particular, and that was patience, because I have never been a patient person. I was that person in the line at the supermarket that when the cashier started to have a nice, friendly conversation with the person ahead of me in line, I'd be tapping my foot because I had so many important things to get to. Patience. I'm a person who sat for 19 months in doctors' offices, waiting for results that were seldom good, waiting for scans, waiting for x-rays, waiting for infusions, waiting for prescriptions to be filled, lying in a hospital bed at night next to my increasingly skinny husband, just to get through the night of so much pain. Patience, I have learned. I learned to walk slowly. Living with an awareness of death. You know, I think there is no greater taboo in our culture than this one. We can talk about sex, we can talk about politics, we can talk about money, we can talk about religion. We do not like to talk about death. That book that I mentioned writing was published last fall, and I went on a book tour, a very long book tour, because really I wanted to go everywhere and tell this story. So I was on the road for a long time, and I noticed a phenomenon when I would speak and tell the story I'm telling to you now. Every night there would be at least one person in the room who would get up partway through and walk out the door. And I'll tell you, I never took it personally. I never considered the possibility that I might be boring or offensive. It was just too hard for some people to look at death. And I think it's very hard for many of us to look at death. And I have learned to make friends with it. Because if there's one experience every one of us in this room will share, it is that we will die. And if we live a life of any duration, we will lose people very dear to us before we do. And a meal that does not go on forever is more savored because it is finite. It is impermanent. Hold on to it while you've got it. Appreciate its preciousness. I want to finally say the biggest lesson for me, which was about the nature of love. the meaning of what it means to be a couple, which took a long time for me to discover, longer than most, perhaps. For me, I learned the meaning of what really mattered in my marriage only after all the joyful, romantic trappings were stripped away, and I saw how unimportant they were compared to what was left. As for my big romantic dream, the 6-foot-tall partner, the one I used to picture as the man at my side, here's what I've learned about that one. The strongest, bravest, biggest-hearted man I ever met was my 5'8" tall Eagle Scout husband who died weighing under 90 pounds. My husband, Jim. See how easily I said that? My husband was the burliest man I ever met.